Elsa, and what's up, Halle? Welcome back to the Frithstead Fireside, a Setters podcast. I'm Folcweard, and this is episode 7, Fate, Årlåg and Wyrd, recorded live. All right, glad to see y'all here. Today, we're going to delve into the very architecture of existence. Now, I want you to set aside the modern ideas of, quote unquote, destiny and luck. The modern ideas, just set that aside for a minute, you know, and because these are the things that we often get from movies and from pop culture. We aren't talking about, well, everything happens for a reason, in a sentimental way, as if we're, well, I'll say this, we're certainly not talking about a moral judge in the sky just handing out rewards and punishment. In the Settian way, that is the traditional ethnic religion of the Germanic peoples. Fate is not a feeling. It's a structure. It's the law of the universe. Now, I want you to understand this, okay? We're going to focus on two native Germanic words. You got Årlåg and Wyrd. Now, Wyrd is the Anglo-Saxon form, and it's related to the Norse Earth or Erd. Now, the Anglo-Saxons used Wyrd to express fate itself, while the Norse preserved Erd. Some people pronounce it with the Erd, and then others anglicize it like Erd. But anyhow, the Norse preserved Erd as the name for the premier Norn that's connected to the threads of fate and what we call the web of Wyrd. She's the Dis, or the goddess of fate and death, ruler over hell and the Hellthing, which is by her underworld well. Now, the purpose of what we're aiming for in this episode is to lay out a clear map for these concepts. And we're going to be doing this in a very specific way. All right. First, we're building a unified model. See, often when people look at Germanic history, they see a mess of different tribes and languages. They think the Old English Wyrd is one thing and the Old Norse Årlåg is another. But if we look closer, we can see that they're actually two sides of the same coin. All right. Think of a grand ancient building. Årlåg is the blueprint and the foundation, the primal laws that are existing since the beginning of time. And Wyrd is like the actual construction process. It is the becoming. It's how those laws play out in your life right now. This is not about seeing these terms as vocabulary words to be memorized, but they're a single and internally consistent system that explains not only how the world works, but how our different tribal ancestors viewed their world. And by extension, I'm hoping to spur you on to examine how you view your faith, like Årlåg, Wyrd, or both. Second, we aren't just making this up, okay? In Settianism, we prioritize the corpus, the actual text left behind by our folk. We're going to look at these texts from the beautiful lines of Old English elegies like The Wanderer, where a lonely man realizes that fate is fully fixed, to the heroic spirit of Beowulf and the legislative power of the Norns that we see in the Poetic Edda. Our faith is grounded in evidence, so we don't need to guess what our ancestors believed about fate. They wrote it down in their poems and preserved their thinking into their story. So we're going to let those voices speak for themselves. And third, we're going to make this practical, usable. Philosophy is useless if you can't live by it. Spending all our time in mental exercises might keep our brain physically healthy, but it does little for our spiritual health. So we're going to translate these ancient concepts into a metaphysical orientation, if you will. And that sounds like a big term, but it just really means, how do you stand in this world? When you understand that fate is law, and it changes how you view, let's say, a tragedy. It isn't punishment, it's a boundary, it's rules. When you understand fate as ancestry, it changes how you view your own blood and the gifts that your parents and ancestors have given you. And this is the core of the Setian soul. So, what is or should be our sacred response? You can't break the threads that the Norns have woven for you, but you can choose how to walk your path. You can walk it with wisdom after acquiring knowledge and understanding, and you can participate through ritual to align yourself with the gods. And above all, you can walk it with honor. Essentially, we're moving from what is fate to how do I meet my fate? So, in this episode, I'm aiming for a broad audience, okay? And given that our folks come from a wide array of backgrounds and abilities, different predispositions, and levels of understanding, um, uh, appealing to the broad audience is best. If you're an educator or a researcher, I do want to address the linguistic and the historical. If you're a theologian or a serious practitioner, someone who's actually following the 16 tenets, then I want to appeal to that and nourish your spiritual practice. But if you're just curious and want to learn, I want to appeal to that as well. Because we're all at different levels and different stages, but yet we all need understanding. So let's continue. Okay, we know that we're living in a time when people feel lost, as if life is just a series of random, chaotic accidents. But the Setian model of Wyrd and Årlåg, it offers an alternative, and it tells us that we are part of an established, woven fabric of life, what most of us call the web of Wyrd. Now, the web imagery comes from the Ólög satir, and that's an Old Norse word that means the threads of fate. And the Anglo-Saxon way of thinking of fate as it's unfolding. So the threads of fate come together to form this web, this complete picture of existence. And it tells us that while we are constrained by the laws of the universe and our own ancestry, our response to those constraints is what defines our character. So let's begin by defining our terms and anchoring ourselves in the language of the folk. Because defining terms is so important. And we all have been there in conversations when you're talking with someone and neither side is getting their point through. And even though y'all might be using the same word, you get to a point where you're realizing that your definitions of those words are different. And that's where the communication mishap comes from. So whether this episode where we're talking about fate, or whether you're just having a conversation with someone, before you get into anything serious, get on the same page with defining terms. When you say this, and when the other person says this, what do you actually mean? Because one word can have different definitions to different people. So we are talking about the traditional ethnic religion of the Germanic people. And it begins with the recognition that fate is sovereign. even if our honor is our own. When we look at fate as a structural architecture rather than a moral judge, we're viewing fate from the same foundation shared by all Germanic peoples. But tribal variance is and has always been a part of our Germanic heritage and our foundation. We have always been strongly folk minded, but simultaneously, we've always been individual minded. Now, this extrapolates out to the clans and the tribes, each retaining their folk mindedness, yet maintaining their uniqueness and freedom of cultural expression. Hence, why the Norse, the Anglo-Saxons, the continental Germans can all be the same yet different. If we look closely at the North Germanic and the West Germanic, we see this manifest. Okay, now the North Germanic, that would be like if you can picture a map today, the North Germanics would be like the Danes, the Swedes, the Norwegians, the Icelanders, whereas the West Germanic would be more German and Frisian, Dutch, English, those peoples. And evidence to show how our ancestors thought about fate is in their poetry. You know, poetry is art. It is an expression of yourself. All right, music, same thing. And the way that a culture or even an individual views the poetry or views their music, that gives you a clue into their worldview. How do they see life? So, in looking at how they composed their sacred writings, is to peer into their zeitgeist. That is the spirit of their age, the taste, the outlook, the worldview of the time period that they lived in. To understand the Setian model of fatalism, let's look into how the Old Norse Galdralag and the Anglo-Saxon longline poetics act as the two heartbeats of the same Germanic soul. Now, given that the Norse expression is the mainstream today in American society, let's begin with Årlåg. Okay, so Årlåg is defined really as primal law, or the primordial law, or the original decree. Think of that as the root. That is what is being laid down in the beginning of time, that is. The Norse mind focused on the legislative power of the Norns. When they thought of fate, their minds went to the immutable laws of Urdurbrunner. Now, Urdurbrunner being Earth's well in the underworld, and that well is one of the three wells that holds one of the roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree, and houses the holy Ærlåg. That is the white, watery, loamy soil of creative power, and they use that water to nourish the world tree. And they thought of Ærlåg, of fate, as the wristed or carved patterns that cannot be unwristed or uncarved. So this focus is perfectly captured in the poetic meter that's known as Galdralag, or the incantation meter, the meter that's used to write and perform Galdr, which is found throughout the Poetic Edda. Now, if you listen to a Norse Galdr, now again I'll define Galdr. That's the ritual chant and the magic song of the North Germanic. All right, you can think of it like when you're praying to a god, you are singing Galdr. So that prayer is words in a specific poetic meter, and it's sung. So it not only is it a prayer, not only is it poetry, not only is it a prayer, but it's also music. It's singing. Now, within this meter, the regular flow of what's called Ljóðháttr, poetic meter, is broken down by an unexpected doubling. A full line is sung, and then a second or even a third, and consecutive full line repeats, or slightly varies the first. Now, this extra line acts as a restrictive binding upon the mind of the listener. It sort of like locks in the speaker's intent. It's the verbal binding that works by clarifying the intent. So it limits the scope and or expands the power. A Galdr, though, is not as smooth flowing, yet it contains a beauty in its style of short command style language. A Galdr will hit with the staccato rhythm of rapid fire orders. Think of Galdr like a sequence of verbal strike, one line command, then the next line hammers that command home, yet just with a slight variation, and it's a locking mechanism of speech, short, sharp, final. This is the very breadth of Orszáłg, where speech, where melodic voice illustrates the law of what is, of what was laid down, the finality of what was decreed. And this auditory style mimics the judicial essence of law, just as a spell in Galdralag is meant to bind as a result. The Norse concept of Orszáłg is the set of laws that bind our existence. And it tells us this is the law. It has been spoken. It has been repeated. It is fixed. Since it was laid down, it will happen. So, ultimately, that, like, when you understand Galdr and when you understand Galdralag, you can see that is the perfect illustration of how the Norse viewed Orszáłg, how they viewed fate. Now, in moving on to the next point, in contrast to the Norse view of fate that I just laid out, I'm going to contrast this with the Anglo-Saxon mentality. And the Anglo-Saxons, instead of saying Orszáłg, they said Wyrd. Now, while the Norse focused on the laws that were laid down, the Anglo-Saxons were deeply moved by how those laws unfolded through time and how we experience these laws in our lives in real time. The word weird comes from the verb werðan, which means to become. So for the Anglo-Saxon, they viewed fate through its unfolding process. And it was the experience of walking the paths that the Norns had already woven. And we hear this in what we call the Anglo-Saxon long line poetic meter. Now, the long line poetic meter is poetic verse consisting of longer runs of lines that are not divided into formal stanzas. Each line is divided into two half lines or verses, divided by a pause or an interruption in the poem, right? And then two verses of the line are linked together by alliteration. So while both are rhythmic, and with the Norse poetry being short, punchy, and commanding, more geared toward a cappella, the Anglo-Saxon poetry was longer, smoother, more flowing, and more geared towards singing with instrumentation. So, get some drink of water a sec. Think of the sweeping rhythmic pulse of Beowulf, or the heartbreaking journey of the wanderer. The long line doesn't stop and repeat itself like the Norse Skaldralag. Instead, it uses alliteration in a way to link the two half lines together, which create a continuous forward moving and thematically flowing third. Think of like a rolling ocean. It's just many sounds of the waves crashing, but yet one continuous sound of the ocean as it just moves forward flowingly. It feels like a tide coming in or a traveler walking across the landscape. And this is the zeitgeist or the worldview of Wyrd. It is the long line of your life. So we can think of Årlåg as foundational blueprints that defines our fate, but yet Wyrd is the experience of us living out that blueprint, seeing the plans constructed in real time. The Anglo-Saxon focus wasn't just on law itself, but more so on the becoming of that law, the way that it manifests in our lives and the inevitable passage of time. So at its heart, Årlåg and Wyrd are the same thing. They're just nuanced ways of viewing it. Like you have one coin, and you're just looking at it from different sides. But that doesn't mean it's not the same coin. So this is where the two branches of our folk meet in a single heathen worldview. They aren't contradicting each other. They're looking, again, like I just said, at the same coin, just at different sides. So hopefully this visual helps you. The Norse looked at the Norns and they saw legislators, goddesses carving, risting, and thus recording and enacting the laws of the cosmos. Whereas the Anglo-Saxons looked at the Norns and they saw weavers, goddesses actively unfolding the fates of men through continuous and unbreaking threads. Now, in Sedianism, in Sedish belief, we recognize that you cannot have the unfolding of Wyrd without the law of Årlåg. You cannot have the long line without the Galdralag, as both are part of who we are. Both are law, and both are sacred, holy truth. Now, I mentioned earlier that fatalism is the bridge that brings these two poetic spirits, these two zeitgeists, together. Now, soft fatalism is the name given in describing fate as being sovereign and unchangeable, yet allowing us the freedom to shape our honor. It acknowledges the Galdralag of the soul. It acknowledges the 50% baseline that we discussed in the episode 4, I believe, on the sustainable happiness model, that certain things are repetitive and fixed, such as your ancestry, when you're born, or the physical laws of the world. You can't break the root, but it also honors the long line poetry of our deeds, that our response to those laws is a continuous narrative. We are the ones who alliterate the lines of our own life, and we are the ones who find the links of honor and courage to connect one moment of fate to the next. So I want to add that whereas we don't, and we never truly know what is fated and what isn't, I want it helpful. I mean, I find it helpful to push aside and accept the fact that we'll never know. Okay, we are not ever going to know. So to become comfortable with this, I treat everything that's happened, the past, all of it, as if everything was fated 100%. And then I treat everything that's going to happen, the future, regardless of what's fated, as if none of it is. It's harnessing the veracity of the Germanic spirit and will to defy all odds, even if there's no hope. Because we are a people, we are a folk that never gives up. So regardless of what was fated or isn't fated, what will be fated, what won't be fated, I treat the past as if everything is, and the future as if nothing is, and I just go forward trying my best. Now, just as Woden spent his time trying to find a way to slow or prevent Ragnarok, or Frigg ceaselessly trying to protect her son Balder, or that lone Norwegian at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, armed with an axe, blocked the bridge crossing and single-handedly held up an entire Anglo-Saxon army, killing more than 40 Anglo-Saxons before being defeated. you know, Woden knows Ragnarok is inevitable. Frigg knew her son couldn't be saved. And that Norseman surely knew he was going to meet death that day at any second. But they faced fate and they did what they could, regardless of what was going on at the time. It didn't matter what the circumstances looked like. They tried. And so must we. Now, as we move forward in this study, I want you to hold these two rhythms in your mind. Okay, the Årlåg rhythm and the long line Wyrd rhythm. Okay, one is the drumbeat of the law, steady, repetitive, primal. The other is the melody of the journey, forward moving, experiential, courageous. Now, together, these form the complete Setian model of faith. You are not a victim of the chaotic universe, nor are you a puppet on a string, but you are a participant in a sacred structure that was sung before you were born and is being lived out in every breath that you take. Fate is fully fixed, yes, but it's also fully becoming and experiential. So let's now look at how these terms are anchored in our language as we move into the history of the words, all right? So let's begin with the term that describes the becoming of the world, Wyrd, W-Y-R-D, Wyrd. We hear this term often in the phrase, the web of Wyrd. That's an Anglo-Saxon Old English term, and as previously mentioned, it's derived from the Proto-Germanic verb "wyrðan," which means to become or to happen. So when an Anglo-Saxon spoke of Wyrd, they weren't talking about the destination, they were talking about a process. And when we apply this to our lives, as in all things, we shouldn't always focus on the destination. As Ralph Waldo Emerson is quoted as saying, life's a journey, not a destination. So we should model our lives around the premise of being committed to a process as opposed to planting our feet in an unchangeable conclusion. As life, faith, it has a way of making fools of us all. And no truer statement has ever been said. I tell you true. Yeah. Word can be said to be the experiential aspect, the events as they are unfolding through time, through our lives. As it's tied to becoming, it literally implies a constant state of motion. Weird is the fate thread, the Årlåg that's here, as they're being pulled through the cosmic loom. Weird is the long line form of poetry that is our lives as it's being written, step by step, breath by breath. And then, Årlåg being that is the structure of the world, the structure of existence. That's the Old Norse term, and it the way that the Norse viewed it reveals a deep metaphysical truth. Now, Årlåg is actually a compound word that's being formed from combining two words. We have Ur and Log. Ur means primal or original, and Log means laws. So if you can just, like, to get a little bit linguistic here, like G, this is the hard D sound, log. Just imagine that softening to become law, log, law, law. They bounce down very similar. Just as time passed, the hard G became softer until it became law. Um, so, not to get too far into the weeds here, but anyway, Årlåg literally translates as the original laws or the primal decrees, and it's a reference to the beginning of history. Now, together, these terms create a single, consistent, and unified model where Årlåg is the deep, unchanging root, and Wyrd is the branch that grows and has a degree of flexibility. And when used in a general sense, ÅrlÅg and Wyrd are both called fate, but I'm just trying to establish that they're nuanced in how they're viewed and understood, so that today, when you use the words, you'll have a better understanding of how to use them, uh, as opposed to just saying, the catch-all fate, because that way you can be a little clearer in your communication, not just in your own thinking mind, but in communicating with others. So by understanding their names and what they mean, we begin to see that our lives are part of a grand design that is both stable, perfect, and alive. And we're not just drifting through life. We're participating in a holy process of becoming that which was set in motion long before we even existed. So look at it like this. You've been given a fully finished and furnished house. The determination that the house and everything that'll be in it is to be yours. Okay, think of that as Årlåg. And then think of showing up early and watching the carpenters, the painters, the furniture movers, decorators, etc., and everything else that is part of the process of making that house into a home, watching it transpire step by step. That's weird. So in understanding these linguistic meanings and worldview nuances, it helps us not only understand our own lives, but to understand the expansive lore that we have at our disposal. So when we read the poetic and the prose eddas, when we read the great Anglo-Saxon poems like Beowulf, the Wanderer, the Seafarer, or Deor, when it gives us that deeper insight, and then it helps manifest change and growth in our lives. When we experience a moment of change, we're experiencing fate as it's manifesting. When Årlåg, the established laws or plan for our lives, when that becomes weird, the becoming that is Årlåg manifesting in our lives at that moment in real time. Now, a good practice is to take time, just to stop a minute and take time to recognize and appreciate weird as it's happening. If you find yourselves enjoying something, whether it's listening to a song, you're on a vacation, or you're sharing a moment with a loved one, let's say, just take the time to say to yourself, this isn't a memory where I'm looking back and missing that time, but this is happening right now, actually, right now. And then you take a moment, you look around, take it all in, and focus on that comfort and the beauty of what you're feeling. So essentially, I'm talking about a stop and smell the roses moment. I mean, we all love good memories, but how many of us spend our time looking for the greener pastures, only to have time pass and realize that while we were looking for those greener pastures, we were already in a greener pasture, but we were too oblivious to see it. So when you understand Årlåg and Wyrd, it helps you to relax and appreciate what you have, to count your blessings, to feel gratitude. And gratitude is the one thing where negativity, that is, that which kills, cannot exist. Now, even deeper, a more tangible aspect of faith is that Årlåg and Wyrd are the anchors that secure our houses, our clans, and our heritage. How is this so? Right? Well, it's so because our Årlåg is not just ours alone, but it's also a significant portion of our luck, which is the inherited strength, the ability to manifest change in our lives that inherited from our ancestors. It's not just from us. So those ancestors contributed a portion of luck to their descendants, and then those descendants to their descendants, all the way down to us. So we are an extension of our ancestors. And in that sense, you could say we are our ancestors in spirit. We're we're born into a web that was already being woven long before we breathed our first breath. Our deeds are but a continuation of that web, and our children and grandchildren will continue to weave their thread. We are not a folk of hyper individualism, but we are a fiercely independent, folk minded folk, if you will. you know, we like the balance. We want to be amongst our folk and with our folk, but we also want to be individuals. And the problem arises when that balance gets off. You can't go too far one way or the other. So we don't need to ask if our weird is good or bad, like in a moral sense, but we should seek to determine if we're aligned with the Orszáłg that has been established for us. Are we in order? Are our houses in order? If not, is there a lesson to be learned from the experience currently happening? And by extrapolating outward, our kindred, our clan, our work, and other spheres of interaction and influence, introspection is a regular practice that we shouldn't neglect. So, as a language guy, I've spent thousands of hours over many years of study looking at Old English, translating, reconstructing Old Norse words into Old English, uh, as well as having an English degree and years of teaching experience. It's a given that I believe it's important to look at the linguistic history. But for me, and certainly not for most of you, this shouldn't just be a dry academic classroom style exercise. That's not what I'm wanting. Um, the goal is to use the understanding to reclaim our ancestral zeitgeist, our ancestral worldview. That is the mindset, the mentality of our ancestors. They saw the world as structured and law bound, yet deeply meaningful and emotionally and spiritually expressive. And we should see the world the way that our ancestors saw it, not the perverted and distorted lens in which today's postmodernism views reality. So anyway, let's move on. We have the root, Orszáłg, and we have the branches, Wyrd. We have the law, and we have the becoming. So now let's turn our attention at how this two-layer model, if you will, how it functions as an operating rule for our lives. Uh, we'll see how we can break the root. We'll see how we can't break the root, but through honor, wisdom, and good deeds, we can shape the way that the branches bend. Like tending a bonsai. Because fate isn't a single flat line. We view it as a two-layered system, an intimate relationship between the root and the branch. So if you understand this relationship, then you understand the concept of what we call soft fatalism as opposed to hard fatalism. And at the heart of this is where the Germanic spirit lives. We see that the human soul is an integrated architecture, right? One of those components is what we call Urther. That's our inspired mind and our agency. Wyrd is the field where our Urther meets our Orszáłg. It is the lived reality of constraint. They're the rules to everything. So when the Anglo-Saxon poet said, Wyrd bit full rad, that is, fate is fully fixed, they were acknowledging that the events of the world have a momentum that we cannot simply get rid of. If a storm comes, the storm is Wyrd. If a shield breaks in battle, that is Wyrd. It is the manifestation of the norms weaving in the physical world. So what is this operating rule of the root and the branch? You can't break the root, but you can bend the branch. In the Western world, we are often told that we have what's called radical free will, that we can be anything, do anything, and create our own destiny from nothing. But Settianism rejects this as a delusion. You cannot ignore the original laws. If you try to break the root, you only break yourself. When you swim against the current, you only wear yourself out, become miserable, and eventually you end up going where the river wanted to take you in the first place. However, we can swim with the current and still make our choices. We can bend the branch and alter certain aspects of the tree, but yet, okay, now I'll say this. While the origin and oftentimes the process and end result of a situation is fixed, and the momentum of the unfolding event is powerful, our response to the events is where we have control. So let's use a practical example. Imagine you were born with a specific physical limitation, okay? That's your Årlåg, the structural law of your body. It's not something that you can just will away or work hard enough for it to go away. That is the root. Now, imagine a difficult situation arises because of that limitation. That is your weird, the experiential unfolding. And so now you're at a crossroads, right? Do you meet that weird with a weary mind, as the poet in The Wanderer warns us against? Do you sink into despair and passivity? Or do you meet it with the Drenskaper, the heroic spirit? You bend the branch by choosing how you respond. You can't change the fact of the limitation, but you can choose to meet it with such clarity, ritual alignment, and courage that the expression of that fate becomes one of glory rather than shame. Or you're in a situation where you and a friend are in disagreement. Do you dig your heels in and refuse to consider that you might be wrong, even if it only in part? Or do you relax and show some understanding and allow open-minded communication to work through the issue? Do you seek resolution or do you just play the victim? Because the thing that we need to always remember, regardless of what's happening, and regardless of how much power we have or think we have in any given situation, we always have a choice. And life is too precious to waste by having pride and stubbornness just get in the way. We all have a choice. Now, these two layers are in a constant harmonic tension, if you will. They're interlocked. And we can see this in our ritual life as well. When we perform a bloat or engage in symbol, we're touching the threads and participating in our own weird in a spiritually tangible way. We're focusing our deeds and intention through ritual to align the branches with the root. And in a way, ritual is a way of singing back to the norms. We aren't trying to cancel faith. That would be an attempt to break the root. And we know we can't break the root. But instead, we're seeking to understand the laws of our current situation so that we can walk our weird with better alignment. Wisdom and discernment can give us the ability to distinguish between what is Årlåg, the unchangeable law, and what is weird, the unfolding path where our choices matter. Like the well-known Serenity Prayer. How's it go? Give us the serenity to accept what cannot be changed, the courage to change what can be changed, and the wisdom to know the one from the other. There's not, there's variations of it, right? Now, that is a Christian prayer, I know, but it's a good sentiment nonetheless. So at least in a philosophical sense, we can still look at that and gain benefit. So just because it's a Christian prayer, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Now, I'm not advocating, you know, syncretism, so don't go off left field there. But I know y'all know where I'm coming from. This is why we call it soft fatalism. It's fatalism because we recognize the sovereignty of the primordial elements, the laws of existence, and the fixed architecture of the cosmos. But it's soft because it leaves room for the human spirit to breathe, to respond, to observe, and to participate. So we've built the framework, okay? We've defined the root and the branch, but what do the sources say? I want to look for the behavior of how fate is viewed in the poem, both from the northern and the western tribes. So let's look at the Wanderer first. This poem captures the experiential side of Wyrd, but it does so very heartbreakingly. The poem tells the story of an Anhaga, that is a solitary man. Uh, a solitary man who has lost his lord and lost his kinsman, and he's forced to wander alone across the cold sea, and he's haunted by memories of the mead hall, of just the good times that he had with his folk and with his kin, all the good memories, and he's faced with the crushing weight of Årlåg and how Wyrd played out in his life. And he reflects on the inevitable decay of everything, from great stone walls to the lives of brave men. And he concluded that true stability can't be found in this world where everything is fleeting. And the most well-known line from the Wanderer is this: Wyrd bit full rad. Wyrd bit full rad. Fate is fully fixed. So let's think about that line in the context of the long line discussion that we had at the beginning of this episode. The poem describes a man who has lost his lord, lost his kin, lost his home. Okay, so he's traveling across the cold sea. He's feeling the bite of the bitter wind, and when he says fate is fully fixed, he isn't making a philosophical guess. He's reporting from the front lines of existence as he's experiencing it and as he knows it to be. And he follows this by saying, Ne me weary mood weary withstundan. A weary mind cannot withstand fate. Then, interestingly, he follows this up with some really good advice. He says, Ne se here helpe ye freman, nor can a weary heart provide any help. And on that, just think back to that Trinity prayer. Wyrd is inevitable. It is the binding condition of existence. Things will happen, and we cannot escape this. Now, notice that the wanderer, the Anhaga, the solitary man, he doesn't say fate is evil or unfair. He just simply acknowledges its sovereignty. That this is the experiential fate, appearing as an immovable wall. You don't argue with winter. You just find the strength to endure it. When things happen, it's best just to deal with it. Now, a saying that I've always enjoyed is this: it is what it is. And that saying, it is what it is, kind of helps you get through life when things are happening. And if you find yourself frustrated with something, you can just say to yourself, it is what it is. And it releases some tension. And But that sentiment, or that statement and sentiment of it is what it is, it's also emphasized in another poem, a poem called Deor. And that's a poem that follows the trope. Now, a trope is the Anglo-Saxon skald. Same thing, just different name. So this trope was exiled from his life of luxury and respect after being replaced by a rival singer, right? And reminding himself that struggles, no matter how great, they always eventually end. And it's this poem that the famous line goes, Das overrode, dieses war May. That passed, and so may this. That passed, and so may this. It is what it is. So, however you want to say it, our that sentiment is still being expressed today as it was thousands of years ago. Maybe different words, but the sentiment is the same. And it's a really fascinating and beautiful thing when we can look at the poetry of the North. We can look at the poetry of the Anglo-Saxons and the way that the poetic meters were formed, as well as how they wrote about things, their perspective. It really connects us with the cultures and how they viewed things, but it also really shows that they were the same people then that we are today. And when you go back to those ancient sources, that's where you really truly can find the answers to the questions and the issues and the problems and the curiosities that we have today. So, okay, moving on. When we've discussed the nuances between Ország and Wyrd and how they're the same but yet they're different. The root, the branches, soft fatalism versus hard fatalism. And I don't want to give the impression, and hopefully I've been clear, but if not, it's important enough to clarify. Wyrd and Ország are the same thing. It's just the way that they're viewed is where the cultural nuance comes in. Um, so with the way that we've been utilizing the term Wyrd, like our Anglo-Saxon forebears before us, we know that Wyrd, like Ország, is unchangeable, but in our responses and application of our mental and emotional intelligences, then we do have a semblance of control. Um, so, what about the poetic Edda? Okay, the poetic Edda, that ultimately is the most primary of all of our sources. If the Old English texts show us the experiential of the long line, the Old Norse texts show us the foundational blueprint of the Galderlag. So in Waluspa stanza 20, we're given the most important structural evidence for our model, and it describes the three Norns coming from the well beneath the tree. It says they established laws, allotted life, and pronounced Ország. This is the primal decree in action. Notice the legal and authoritative language used, because they legislated. They laid down the original laws. They carried out the law. They allotted life, and they declared the law as done. They pronounced Ország. And this confirms our claim that Ország is architecture. It is the root that is fastened before the branch ever grows. We find further imagery of this fastening, if you will, in a poem called Helga Vida Hudingsbana 1. The poem describes the Norns twisting the threads of fate and fastening them beneath the moon's hall. when shaping a prince's lifetime, right? And now, okay, this is not chaos. This is not randomness, but it's intentional ordering. When the Norns fasten our threads, they're setting the Årlåg, the structural reality that will spend our lives unfolding as weird. Finally, we must look at how this applies to the individual. In Skirnismal 13, there's a very powerful line. Quote, "My destiny was shaped by a single day. My entire life was laid down from the start." Unquote. If your whole life is laid down, then one might ask, so why bother acting at all? Now, the answer lies in the mind of the speaker. Okay, Skirnir isn't speaking in despair. He's speaking with the dignity of someone who knows his place in the great web. He recognizes that Årlåg, his allotted structure, and because he knows the boundaries, he's free to act within them with absolute clarity. He knows that one moment of action can define who he is, because his path was already set by the ancient laws of fate. And so, what do these texts tell us when we put them all together? They tell us that fate is legislative. The Norns lay down laws. They tell us that fate is inevitable. Wyrd goes ever at we shall. They tell us that fate is non-moral. That is, it's a neutral condition, like the weather or the sea. It just is. And so, as you listen to these quotes, I want you to hear the two-layer model in their voices. Hear the Årlåg in the Norns decree, the fixed, repetitive law. Hear the Wyrd in the wanderer's journey, the unfolding experiential becoming. Our ancestors were not confused about fate. They didn't see it as a mystery to be solved or a concept to wonder about, but as a sacred reality to be respected. And, you know, today, most of us get confused about what is fate, what is Årlåg, what is Wyrd. And, being that our ancestors were not confused about it, that's what this whole episode is about, is my attempt to try to explain these these complex this complex issue and make it into something simple, because like anything, when you're learning it, it's hard, but once you learn it, it's easy. When you're learning it, it's complex, but once you learn it, it's simple. And so that's the main reason what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to get us into the mentality, into the mindset of our ancestors, so that we can not just always be striving to learn what they know, but to actually say, hey, at least in this, and this, I know. Now, of course, there's always going to be more to learn, but each box that we can check off, it should be a feeling of pride. So, by looking at these examples, we separate observation from inference. The observation is that the text describes fate as fixed and sovereign. The inference is how we should live in response to that reality. So we're moving now from the what of the literature to the how of our agency. If fate is fully fixed, then what is left for us? So we must think about the threads of our own life. Some are vertical, fixed, heavy, ancient. That's our Årlåg. Some are horizontal, moving and unfolding right now. That is your Wyrd. The weaver standing at the loom. You did not choose these threads, and you did not build the loom, and much of the pattern is determined. But how that pattern emerges, the story of how you met your fate, how you handle situations, how you live your life, that is your contribution to and participation in the great web. You are like the painter, adding color to the web. You may not be that carpenter who built it, but you're the painter who's making it look good. So if everything is truly fixed, does my effort actually matter? Now, this is where many people trip up and they fall into the trap of what's called hard fatalism. That is the cold, mechanical idea that we're just puppets dancing on strings pulled by the Norns. But Steadianism contains a much more profound truth. We can look at the integrated soul to understand why our actions are not just meaningful but sacred. Now, when we look at the concept of the Germanic soul, uh, now on a little side note, uh, I do have the structure of the book for reconstructing the Germanic soul, ascetic perspective, um, outlined, and I'm very close to getting that published, but just due to life things, there's been some delays. So hopefully, maybe sometime this year, I'll be able to get that out. So be on the lookout. But back on track here. Um, in reconstructing the Germanic soul, we see that we're not just one simple immortal essence, but we are a complex, layered architecture of divine gifts. To understand how we can have agency within a sovereign fate, we have to look at the specific faculties given us by the gods. So while the Norns administer the Årlåg, the structural field that we exist in, the gods provided us with the tools to navigate it. And the most critical gift for this discussion is Other. Now, in our lore, Other is the gift that Honir gave to Ask and Embla. Now, Honir, for those of you who don't know, is Rodin's brother, and he's one of the three brother gods who created the first uh, the first of our folk, named Ask and Embla. And so Other is that gift that Honir gave. And it's often translated as inspiration or mind, but it's our ordering mind and our inward agency. It's the part of the soul that allows us to connect to the divine and crucially to process the world around us. Think of it like this. Årlåg provides the data, the circumstances, and the boundaries of your life. But Other is the engine that determines your internal alignment with that data. It's the faculty that takes the fixed events of your life and then turns them into a narrative that you're able to understand and participate in. So breaking that even more, a little bit more nuanced, within Other, we have two moving parts. We have the Huger and the Muner. Huger, that's your cognitive intent, your thought that moves outward into the world. Muner, that's your memory and your desire, your longing for things. That your Muner is your internal anchor. So when you face a fated moment, your Huger is what decides the direction of your spirit. And the Norns might have woven a moment where your shield is going to break, but it's your Huger that decides whether you drop your sword in despair or you draw up your sex knife and finish the fight. And this is the case for soft fatalism. Fate defines the boundary, it defines the condition of the event, but it does not nullify the quality of your soul's presence within that event. And this leads us to another vital component of our soul, the Litragoda, or the inner hue. In the Setian model, okay, Liter isn't just your outward appearance, but it's your moral character. It's the quote unquote look of your soul, if you will. And so, okay, back to the web analogy. Think of your life as a thread, right? And the Norns have determined the length of that thread and its placement in the great web. That is the deterministic part, right? But your deeds, driven by your odor, are what provide the color, the strength, and the shape of that thread. Like just like a body, we're not given a choice on what body we have, but we are given faculty of how we take care of it and how we clothe it, on if it's going to be healthy or unhealthy, what style it's going to have. If you live a life of cowardice and broken oaths, your thread is stained and dark. But if you live in honor, your thread is bright and clear. And the event, the thread's path is fixed, but the ethical quality is your responsibility. And this creates a massive shift in how we view responsibility. In the modern world, people often think that if they can't control the outcome, they aren't responsible for the action. But Ascetian sees it exactly the opposite, because the outcome may be in the hands of the Norns, and therefore we're relieved of the burden of managing the universe. We don't have to worry about whether our actions will change the world in a grand and radical sense. Instead, we're free to focus entirely on the integrity of our response. We just simply do the best we can and hope for the best. So if we change the world, great. But if not, we can still stand before the Hellthing on that appointed day and hear our Fylgja tell us, or tell the gods, that we did the best we could with what we had. So in understanding fate and how it works via Årlåg and via Wyrd, and understanding our odor and how it functions, it's a stress reliever, because we know that it is what it is. When something happens, well, that passed, and so may this. We just do the best we can, and because we know that is what we're going to be judged by. Now, the ethical consequence here is what we can call the heroic fatalism. If I know that my death day is set, then I can stop wasting my odor on the fear of dying, or the fear of living, for that matter, right? So I strive to use my odor to focus on the manner of my living. And this is the ultimate expression of my agency. Because radical free will is a delusion, because it ignores the gravity of our ancestry, and it ignores the laws of the cosmos. But hard fatalism will put you in a prison, because it ignores the divine gift of the ordering mind. The Stedian stands in the middle, and we recognize that, yes, we are bound to Årlåg, yet we are free to alliterate our life's poem with honor and flow with the experience of Wyrd as it unfolds before us. So whether something that we're going through was fated as a script to be had, or if there is some agency that we can work with, we can be happy knowing that we are participants in the grand, in the cosmic understanding and workings of creation itself. And to me, that's exciting. But understand this, right? When we talk about agency, we aren't talking about changing our destinies like we're rewriting the script. We're talking about participation. You are a participant in the weaving. You are the one that determines whether your part of the web is a mess of tangled, fearful knots, or a clean and honorable pattern. This is the soft of the fatalism part. The recognition that while the architecture is divine and immovable, and the thread is the web, the thread in the web is going to make a pattern beyond our control. The beauty of that pattern, when zoomed out, is on us. So we don't ask, how can I escape what's happening? We ask, how do I stand in the midst of what is happening and do what's best? How do I handle this? And by answering that question with honor, we prove that even in a world where fate is sovereign, our soul is never an automaton slave. So now I want to pivot just a bit and continue to evolve our conversation. You see, our ancestors didn't just think in abstract logic. Like us, they thought in pictures, in textures, and in sounds. And I want to form in words a picture of the Setian worldview. So I want us to look at the grammar of existence. All right? We have the thread, the carving, the law, and resonance. Look at these as descriptions of how Årlåg and Wyrd interact with our lives. So let's start with the one that we hear most often, the thread. Now, we've discussed the Årlåg set here, the threads of fate, but I want to discuss on their strength and their interconnectedness. When we look at fate as a thread, we're seeing the physics of our social and ancestral bonds. In Setianism, no thread exists in a vacuum. Your thread is twisted and knotted into threads of your kin, those you interact with in life, your ancestors, and your descendants. Every day, your threads are interacting with everyone you come in contact with, and their threads with yours. And this metaphor teaches us about consequence. If you pull on one part of the web, the vibration travels through the whole structure. Does not the spider know that the fly is in the web if not for the vibratory effect, right? When we say that fate is woven, we're acknowledging that our lives are a network to reality. The honor of your house is tied to the actions of the individuals within. If one person frays their thread in dishonor, then the whole entire cloth of the family is weakened. This metaphor of a thread reminds us that we are part of a larger fabric of Frith, a social piece that's literal, structural, and meaningful on both an earthly and a cosmic level. Everything affects everything. But fate isn't just flexible like a thread, it's also hard as stone. And that brings us to our second metaphor, the carving. We're told that the Norns wristed, and now wristed is another word that means carved, and it describes the permanence of Årlåg. When something is wristed into the world's bones, it cannot be uncarved. And this is the memory of the world. So think about your deeds. Think about your actions. Once your deed is done, once you've done something, the past is the past. It's carved into your legacy. And it moved from the becoming of Wyrd into the fixed law of your Årlåg. This is like as you are perceiving it, that is. And this is why our ancestors were so obsessed with reputation and legacy. They knew that while our bodies are temporary, the carving of our names remain forever. Now, in Setish practice, we treat our lives as the stone upon which we're risking our character. The Norns carve the original laws that set the stage, but every time you uphold an oath, you are risking a line of honor that man and the gods alike will recognize at the end of the age. And this sense of permanence leads us to our third metaphor, which moves us from the wristed stone to the courtroom of the cosmos, the law. Now, we see that fate functions as the ultimate constitution of the cosmos. And this isn't a matter of luck or cosmic winds, right? But it's an objective and impartial order. Think of fate as an operating system of reality, okay? It works much like the laws of nature. Gravity doesn't care if you're a good person or a bad person. If you step off a cliff, gravity is going to act. This is the legislative essence of the norms. They are the guardians of the cosmic order. And this is why we bloat. To acknowledge our place within that structure and seek balance, rejecting chaos and embracing order. When we align our steps with Wyrd, we are essentially practicing legal compliance. Are we living in harmony with the laws of our folk, our ancestry, and the natural world? If you ignore this law, you aren't becoming free. You're becoming lawless. And just as a lawless person is eventually crushed by the society that they rebel against, those who reject the structure of fate are eventually broken by reality itself. True freedom isn't the absence of rules, it's the power to act with purpose inside those rules. Structure and standards will always be the way forward, and the absence of structure and standards will only lead to chaos and ruin within. And law provides the boundaries that allow our freedom to mean something. Now, lastly, we come to a metaphor that goes even deeper: resonance. This is where the spirit of the law meets the mind of the person. If Årlåg is the fundamental frequency that the norms are tuned to and the frequency that the gods interact with, then our life is a matter of alignment. So imagine two tuning forks for those musicians out there. If you strike one, the other will begin to vibrate as if, that is, if they're tuned to the same frequency. Now, think of our odor, our inspired minds, as our personal tuning fork, if you will. Our job is to find the resonance of Årlåg. When we engage in ritual, when we come to understand the truth of the 16 Setian tenets, and when we act with Drenskaper, we are tuning ourselves. But understand that when you're in resonance with your fate, life doesn't necessarily become easy, but it does become right. You stop fighting the current and you begin to flow in the direction that you're supposed to be going. You aren't just a static thread or a dead carving, but you are a living participant in a cosmic song. Now, even if you're in a moment or going through something that just is difficult and it causes you pain or heartache or anger or frustration, if you know that you are flowing in with the fate of your life and things are right, then you can get through it because you know that you're going through it for a reason. That is the Årlåg that was laid down for you. So you connect, you tune, you align with that Wyrd, and just go with it, get through it, and do what you have to do. So look at your life through these four lenses. The thread, who are you connected to, and how are your actions affecting the web? The carving, what are you risking into your legacy today that will outlast your life? The law, are you standing on the solid foundation of order, or are you dwelling in chaos? And resonance, is your soul singing the same song as your ancestors and will of the gods, or are you out of tune? These metaphors are teaching tools that help us visualize that integrated architecture that we've been discussing, and they show that fate is a masterpiece of engineering woven for strength. carved for permanence, legislated for order, and sung for beauty. I've said it before, philosophy is useless if you can't live by it. So the question now is, how do we live in the world? How do we take what we understand about fate and apply it to our lives? How do we walk with Wyrd? Walking with Wyrd is a discipline of the spirit. It's a realization that while you can't break the thread, you can trace its path with clarity. Fate may be fixed, but it's participatory. And this still can sound like a contradiction to the Western worldview, but to the Setian, it's the very heart of our sacred response. You see, the most powerful tool we have for this participation specifically is ritual. And the main ritual is bloat. When we stand before the gods and the ancestors, we aren't there to change the minds of the Norns. We aren't trying to manifest a different destiny or use magic to override the laws of the universe. See, that would be an attempt to break the root. And as we know, those attempts only lead to frustration and misery. Instead, we view bloat as an act of alignment, of participation. So, ritual, in a way, can be seen as a way of singing back to Årlåg. When we offer the horn or the sacrificial gift, we're engaging in the gift for a gift tradition. We're activating our odor, our inspired mind to the frequencies of the divine. And our goal is to reach a state where our internal resonance matches the Galder of the gods. Practical and physical theology. When you're in alignment, you aren't fighting your Wyrd. You are navigating with the wind at your back. You gain the wisdom to see the path the Norns laid out, which allows you to move with purpose rather than stumbling in the dark. Now, in our modern New Age or self-help culture, people are often told that they can create their own reality if they just believe hard enough. But we reject this as a delusion that ignores the sovereignty of the Norns. We practice participation without delusion. We participate in our lives with our effort, our courage, and our odor, but we do so fully accepting that the outcomes are already laid down. While the New Age delusion claims that ego can rewrite the threads of the Norns, we recognize that our 40% intentional effort is not trying to change the fated outcome, but for strengthening the internal character that meets it. By investing our odor into meaningful activity rather than trying just to wish away our Årlåg, we move beyond being victims of our 50% baseline to become masters of ourselves, masters of our spiritual alignment. And then we also acknowledge that 10% of our life involving the external circumstances, is that low yield account, is serving as the shifting weather of our journey rather than the foundation of our soul. And so ultimately, we don't use our agency to alter the destination, but to ensure that the how of our journey is carved with such honor that it resonates in the well for generations to come. So, think of a sailor in a storm. He doesn't have the delusion that he can stop the wind or the wave. That's the Wyrd of the sea, and it is sovereign. It's Årlåg acting itself out. But the sailor participates fully by trimming the sails, steering the rudder, keeping his mind focused, his heart steady. Uh, his posture is one of alignment with the wind, not rebellion against it. And that is how Setians walk with Wyrd. We use our ritual life to stay seaworthy, if you will, ensuring that our internal integrated architecture is strong enough to handle whatever the Norns send our way. Now, to help us maintain this posture, we have the 16 tenets. In Setish belief and practice, these tenets are the defining boundaries of our faith. Now, they aren't just suggestions, we consider them law. And tenet 10 is explicitly states, quote, fatalism is an integral part of our ancestral ways, end quote. When we use the tenets as our compass, we could say that we're choosing to walk within the legal compliance of Årlåg. If you're faced with a choice, look at the tenets. If you're faced with a choice, look to the Drengskaper Code. The Drengskaper Code of loyalty, determination, courage, justice, generosity, honesty, composure, mercy, integrity. The attributes that we need to manifest. By doing this, you're ensuring that your deeds, the long line poetry of your life, alliterates correctly with the Ďardarlag poetry of the original law. You're using the 16 tenets to bend the branch toward a legacy of honor. And this is how we avoid the weary mind mentioned in The Wanderer. We have a structure to lean on. We aren't drifting. We are walking a path that's been walked by our ancestors for thousands of years. Orthodoxy tells us, okay, that the span of our life is allotted, right? Which is essentially saying that right belief teaches us that our time is measured. So orthopraxy teaches us how to act within it. In other words, how to live rightly with the time that we have. Then we have what's called practical theology. And that's what connects belief to action. It explains why we should live with urgency, order, and sacred purpose instead of drifting through life as if time were endless. And we see this clearly in Skirnismal. As previously mentioned, Skirnir says that his whole life was laid down. And this is not a reason for passivity, but it's a call to urgency because we know that our time is measured and we can't afford to waste our odor on things that don't matter. We don't waste our strength trying to escape the inevitable. Instead, we focus on the sacred response, meeting what must come with a clear mind, an ordered will, and an honorable action. So if your Årlåg involves a season of struggle, and it will, probably many of them in the course of your life, then your sacred response is just to find the lesson to be learned in that. Maintain your honor and perform the necessary rites to stay connected to your kin and your gods and keep alignment with Årlåg and Wyrd. We trace the path by paying attention to the signs and paying attention to the needs of those within our inner circle and spheres of influence. Now, our loyalty is always first to our blood and those adopted or married in, and to our faith and those of our faith. When we serve our family and folk, we're participating in the fate inheritance of our children, and we're ensuring that the threads we add to the web are strong and bright. So, walking with Wyrd is never about control. But it's about integrity. It's about showing up to your life with your mind wide open and your hands ready to work. It's about using the bloat to stay in tune with the gods and internalizing the 16 tenets to stay in line with the law. We accept the Ďardarlag of the universe, the repetitive fixed laws, and then we sing our long line with all the honor we possess. We're participants in a divine masterpiece, and that's cause for celebration. We may not be able to write the script of Årlåg, but we're the ones who give it performance. And in the end, when we stand at Earth's well to be judged, and it won't matter if our life was easy or hard, none of that's going to matter. What will matter is if we walk the path that the Norns gave us as a Drengr, following the Drengskaper Code, the heroic spirit. So, if we step back and look at the whole structure, we can see that the Setian model of fate is not a loose pile of disconnected ideas, but a coherent and complete worldview. The Old English and in the The Old Norse attestations, uh, the Eddas, the sagas, and even later reflections all point towards the same fundamental truth. Fate is sacred, ordered, and participatory. Wyrd bith full rad. Fate is fully fixed. We must be like the Anglo-Saxon mind and look at life and see the unfolding of a structure that's already set in motion and established. Wyrd is what happens, what becomes, what rises up through time and encounter. It is the long road under your feet, the cold sea before the exile, the broken hall behind. And it's the duty to keep walking. The concept of Wyrd is not passive surrender, but a recognition of an unyielding pattern. Now, where the wanderer speaks of fate as fully fixed, Beowulf provides the certainty of its movement. In Beowulf, we see Gasa Wyrd Swahil shall. Fate goes ever as she shall. And this reinforces the view that life follows an internal logic that cannot be bargained with. It's the movement of the tide. And that tide does not hate the swimmer, but it's not going to cease its motion for him. And to the Germanic mind, there's a grim comfort in this certainty. If the path is already set, then again, the only question left is how the person chooses to walk. We see this resilience in the poem of Dior. That passed, and so may this. Wyrd is shown as a cycle of both ruin and relief. Just as the sorrows of the past will eventually end, the current hardship is also subject to the unfolding of time. It's a call to composure by acknowledging that all things, kings, exiles, empires, us, all of it is woven into this fixed structure, and the individual gains the strength to endure it. One stands firm because, in the eyes of Wyrd, every winter eventually yields to the turning of the world. Das overrode, thesis swame is another way of saying it is what it is. You know, when we speak of thread fastened, of fate woven, of no cancellation, no uniting, no undoing of what has been laid down, we're not speaking of contradiction to the old sources, but we're extending their logic, because once a deed is done, it's in that web. And so again, we just need to relax, understand fate, understand the nuance, and move on. And this is a critical difference between Germanic fatalism and modern despair, because modern despair says, if I cannot control the outcome, then nothing matters. Why should I even try? If there's nothing that I can do, why even try? But that speaks to you as a person. You must ask yourself, if you're just willing to give up that easily, what kind of person are you? You really want to be like that? But because you want to rise to the challenge, you want to look back and be like, I'm proud of the way I acted. I'm proud of the way I've done. Dramatic fate knows that the outcome may not fully be yours, but your honor is. And that's what we have to focus on. And we're relieved of the false sense of burden managing the universe. And that just takes that weight right off us. So we really need to ask the practical question, what does this model actually produce if we take it seriously? And really it produces three concrete outcomes. First, it demoralizes fate. Fate is not the universe rewarding good people and punishing bad people in a neat childish pattern. Good men suffer. Cowards sometimes prosper. Children inherit burdens that they neither wanted nor chose. Houses rise and fall. The sea drowns the noble and the wicked alike, right? The storm doesn't stop to ask whether you deserve it or not. And this doesn't mean the world is meaningless. It just means that fate is structure, plain and simple. It's law, it's architecture. This matters because many people destroy themselves trying to morally interpret every hardship. They ask themselves, why is this happening to me? What did I do to deserve it? And sometimes the answer is nothing. Sometimes the thing happened because that's just what was fated to happen. The better question is not why did I deserve this or what did I do? The better question is, okay, well, this is going on. So how do I meet this without losing my honor? How do I act right in this situation? How do I navigate it? How do I steer the ship through the storm? And second, this worldview restores dignity under constraint. People often believe that dignity requires total control, that if they cannot control the outcome, then they feel powerless. And if they're powerless, then they assume life has defeated them. But our ancestral worldview says otherwise. Dignity does not come from controlling everything. Dignity comes from standing rightly inside the limits given to you. And this is why the heroic posture becomes intelligible. The hero is not heroic because he has unlimited options. He's heroic because he acts nobly regardless of his options. And in no matter the cost, no matter the danger, honor is the mode of meeting weird. It is the disciplined shape of the soul when pressed against necessity. A man may not choose the storm, but he can choose whether he panics or takes the rudder. A woman may not choose the grief laid upon her, but she can choose whether she becomes bitter or grows from it and becomes better. A house may not choose every burden it inherits, but it can choose whether it adds fame to the inheritance or begins restoring strength and healing. This is not passive acceptance, it's ordered endurance. It's not weakness, it's the refusal to let hardship deform the soul. And third, this worldview gives us a disciplined definition of agency. Agency doesn't mean pretending that there are no boundary conditions. Agency doesn't mean I can become anything, or I can manifest anything, or I can rewrite reality if I just want it bad enough. That's not strength. That's fantasy. And again, that doesn't mean we can't manifest real change in our lives, because of course we can. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is how agency is the power to shape expression, readiness, alignment, and response as we flow with that which is what's becoming. You can shape expression the way your deeds appear in the world, the way your character is seen, and the way your name is remembered. You can shape readiness, the discipline of your body, mind, household, and spirit before the hard hour arrives. You can shape alignment, worship the gods, venerate the ancestors, believe and follow the tenets, live the Drink Copper Code. You can shape response, whether you meet the unfolding of weird with clarity or confusion, courage or cowardice, honor or excuse making, but you cannot honestly call yourself wise if you deny the root. Ancestry, your physical body, time itself, death, consequences, and divine law are not optional. They are the boundary conditions of your existence. Now, the Germanic worldview surrounding Wyrd and Årlåg produces maturity, and it strips away childish moral bargaining. It restores dignity in suffering, and it teaches agency without delusion. And it says, you're not sovereign over the whole pattern, but you are responsible for the integrity of your thread. And we walk the woven path with integrity. We don't control the whole web. We just control what which we are responsible for. We did not speak the law first, but we live under it. We did not carve the root, but we must bear the fruit from the branch. Weird bit ฎ Swa Gatha Heus Swa Heus Dal. Fate is fully fixed, as she goes ever as she shall. And so the question is whether we meet her as cowards or as men and women of honor. And I choose honor. I choose to walk with wisdom. I choose to keep ritual and stand aligned. And no, I'm not perfect, but that's not going to stop me from trying. Not trying to be perfect, but just trying to be better and trying to do right. And when Wyrd unfolds, I choose to meet it like a drunger. And all of these things that I choose, I trust that you will as well. And I encourage you to choose that as well. I believe in you and I know you can do it. And so with that, we'll conclude this episode. And I thank you for joining me. Much, much appreciation. Our task is simple. Meet life with courage, honor, and good intention. And until next time, stay strong, stay true, and hold fast to your faith, your kin, and your folk. Hail the gods, hail the folk, hail the ancestors, and hail the Frithstead. And I'll see you on the next one. Have a good one.
And for a special addendum, here's a talk by Mark Puryear from the Neurona Society at Sumer Mall 2026.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Puryear. I'm going to be giving a talk tonight on fatalism in ancient Nordic or Scandinavian Germanic societies. All right. So what we're going to be talking about tonight is the idea of fate and how it works within a fatalistic system of polytheism and how these people looked at it and how they actually viewed it. This is a very controversial topic. A lot of people freak out. They have all kinds of debates. There's people who will tell you, well, yeah, there was fate, but there wasn't really fate, and things like that. I mean, the idea is that, no, they had fate. It was a fatalistic system. Fate was a real thing. We have the Norns. The Norns weave fate, weave destiny, and it's part of it within the structure itself. However, what we're going to discuss here in order to understand fully and kind of help a lot of people to understand the differences between what we see as fate, right, and what is actually part of the system that we're talking about, right? And what this is, the differentiation is a system that is within the divine realm and one that is without the divine realm. And ours is without, okay? Because the thing is that people would always ask me, the number one question is about divine punishment, okay? If you have a system of justice, of divine justice, where you stand before the hell thing and the gods are judging you and they're saying, hey, you did bad stuff and you need to be punished for that bad stuff, your first question would be, then why did you create me that way? Why did you give me this fate? Why did you do that? That's not what this is, okay? The structure itself is without the entire divine realm. It's not part of the gods. Fate is completely separated from the divine. So it's not predestination. Predestination is built within the divine structure, okay? Predestination is that this God, who is omnipotent or omniscient, he creates everything, and therefore he gives you this fate and then punishes you for it, which is to me a bit insane. And then who wants to follow that, But the thing is that if it's without itself, then even the gods themselves are vessels of fate. And so when they are punishing as vessels of fate. They are representing the fatalistic system themselves that they are a part of. And we're going to give examples. I'm going to go over it. But first I want to talk to you about what is fate. So we have two words in our sources, right? We have Årlåg. Everybody heard that word before. And then we have Wyrd, okay? Now Wyrd is an Anglo-Saxon term primarily, okay? In Old Norse, it's Ørd, the goddess Ørd. She's the goddess of fate, right? So we don't really ever see in the Old Norse them actually using it as a term for fate. She is the goddess of fate, right? And so Årlåg is the word that they use. And you see that in this structure, it's broken down very meticulously in the Eddas, in our sources, in our material, that this system is undeniable and it's unescapable. It is a part of it. It is a part of the faith itself, and it can't be denied. It can't be justified. It can't be worked around. Maybe I can do this. Maybe I can do that. It's like, no, fate is fate. Even the gods themselves don't get to escape it. And if the gods can't escape it, then what chance do you have? And so we see ฎurlóg means the original law. It's primal law. Basically, I look at it as kind of like you throw stuff out, it comes back. It's sort of like a karmic system. It's the idea of everything is connected. Today, like in this festival, in this gathering we've had, everybody's coming together and we're meeting new people. In that instant right there, your thread of fate, it's called ฎurlógfatar. It means the thread of fate or thread of destiny. It's basically, it intertwines. And so now we're all part of this web together. We've all met each other. Our lives are going to be connected from now on because we know each other. And we have these points of connection. And we see that in the Helgek Vida Hundinsbana, right? We see the Norns come at his birth and they throw his threads of fate up into the stars and they weave his destiny to become a great king, right? And I actually was talking to a lady who was an astrologer, and I was like, that might have a relation to that because you're talking about weaving fate in the stars, right? And so our ancestors saw that. They looked at fate, and if you look at polytheistic systems today, they understand the same exact thing, right? Because you can't have a divinatory system without fate. These people who are telling you things that they can see in the future, I have magic powers and I can throw tarot cards down and read in a crystal ball and all that stuff. If they don't believe in fatalism, they are frauds. They are grifters. They are lying to you because one can't exist without the other. Because the ancient word for it was seer, right? And what does seer mean? One who sees. Well, what are you seeing? You're seeing the pattern of fate. It's not even really, if you look at a lot of it, there's not really a whole lot about it being some super ability, some super skill. It just was people who could interpret these things and understood them, right? So it's not like they had magic powers, just they could discern it. They could see the pattern and break things down. And a lot of things that we look today in, systems of prediction and just looking at how things are going to unfold and having pattern recognition, things like that, it would be the same thing. Because our ancestors took nothing for granted. Everything was part of the religious system. Everything was connected to it. So we have that as part of that. So we understand, Odin warns us against flattering valas. Flattering valas, they just tell you what you want to hear. So you give money, or whatever, prestige or whatever they want out of that. So you have to understand that if they're just doing that, then they're not part of a fatalistic system. They're not understanding what they're doing, and they're just grifting you. So like if anybody ever goes to somebody like that and talks to them, ask them if they're a fatalist. If they don't, walk away because they're lying. They're just playing a game. And so this thing is what we see in this fixed structure, and that everything is inevitable. It's connected to a force. It's like gravity. It's not like a being writing your story in a book. It's just a force of existence, that all things have a destination and all things are on a line of existence. Everything moves within the web, and then everything affects everything else, like ripples in a pond. You drop a stone in the pond, it just ripples through the whole pond. That's what everything is. All of existence is. The one thing that I always used as a great example of this is the internet, right? We could see the internet as something that human beings created, and yet it represents all of us because all of us have put something into it. And so it's literally like when they called it the World Wide Web, it was pretty incredible they did so because we have the web of Wyrd, the web of destiny, this threads that move through existence. And now we can literally look at these threads, in these computers that just span and span and span, and millions and millions and millions of terabytes of information just always moving in this constant web of information. And so then you expand that to life itself, and all of life is data. It's data and particles and things that move together and everything connecting to everything else. And so as those things connect and they're all interweaving and everything is related to everything else, then you see that you are part of this existence. And so that part of the existence that you're in reflects upon who you are as a person. You're still going to make the choices. You're going to still play out the script, right? But this thing is so much bigger than all of us that it knows what's going to happen before it happens. And so you think that like when you have your prediction or you have an intuition on something, you can see something's going to happen based on something else, right? Now imagine that with intelligence that's 20,000 times smarter than any of us in this room. Then it's going to be like, of course you're going to do that. That's what you're doing. This is going to happen next. It's an intelligence that exists within the universe, that everything is already scripted out. It's already there. It's already going to happen, right? And we see this play out in our stories. We see it play out in our sources. And the thing is that in every one of them, they're telling you this is an inescapable inevitability. It is part of nature. It is part of reality. And even science recognizes this. Predeterminism is a part of science. Fate is real. And people who try to no, I'm like a libertarian and I don't believe in any of that stuff. And it's like, well, you can not believe in it all you want to. It's still a scientific fact. It is a fact of our faith. It's a fact of our lore, our history, our ancestral beliefs. Like it just is, It's like trying to say like a tidal wave's coming at you and be like, nah, it's not coming at me. I'm just standing here, I'm fine, So we have sources that mention this. So Anglo-Saxon sources, Beowulf, Wyrd goes ever as it must. Then there was an Anglo-Saxon poem called The Wanderer. Wyrd is fully fixed, and no one withstands Wyrd. Then another poem from the Battle of Malden, Wyrd is strongest, right? In Voluspa, we see the Norns lay layers, they choose lives, and they speak ÅrlØg. They speak the fate of men. We also see in Fjolsvindsmal the mention of the Manna Mjótud. Now, here's an interesting concept of that, right? Manna Mjótud means the fates of men. Mjótud was a word for fate as well, right? When the Anglo-Saxons were translating the Bible into their language, right? The word that they chose for God was Mjótud, which means fate, because it was the closest thing they had to something that was omnipotent. The closest thing they had to have was it's like everything, So the monotheists come in and no, this is everything. Okay, we'll call it Mjótud because it doesn't really change much for us, And so you have in Atlamal in Grönlandsku, no one could flee his Årlög from Frithstead saga. No man breaks his Årlög. And then we go into the story of Baldur's death, right? Now, the story of Baldur's death is the ultimate fatalist concept. It is the one that breaks all of anything that you understand, you think that you understand about fate or whatever. When you read the story of Baldur's death, it shows you you're not going to change anything. You just have to play out your script. Baldur has baleful dreams. He starts worrying he's going to die. He tells the gods about this, and they're all worried because Baldur is the most beloved of the gods. He goes to him, and Frigg goes around the entire universe and asks every single thing in the universe not to harm Baldur, to swear oaths upon it. Odin later goes and he asks every single seer that he can possibly find to give him some kind of information to help him save his son. And every single one of them tell him he's fated to die. He's not going to survive. He goes to Yrd himself, and she tells him the story of Voluspa, right? And in it, he dies. Ragnarok happens. It's coming. You cannot stop it, right? And it devastates him, right? He goes back to Asgard, and they play the game, and you know how it plays out. Baldur gets killed. He dies anyway. Now, you think of this, the gods go undertake the largest, project they have ever undertaken to go literally speak to everything in the universe and ask them to take an oath to spare Baldur. And they couldn't save him, right? And I think that's the moral of that story, is that you can go to the ends of the earth to try to stop it, but it's not going to. It's just not, right? But here's where the great part of it is, because a lot of that sounds a little dark, a little negative, right? What the gods give us is the ability to face that fate, right? They give us the ability, like we see when Sigurd is going off to fight Fafnir, and he's like, I'm destined for this. This is my fate, and I will meet it like a man with strength and power and honor, right? And they say that's why our ancestors were some of the toughest warriors who ever lived, because they were like, I'm fated to die anyway. Let's jump in the fire. Let's do it, That's where their strength came from. That's where their power came from, because they weren't afraid of it. They accepted it. They didn't try to run from it and hide from it and be like, oh, no, maybe it's this. Maybe I could do this and change things. Maybe I could figure out some way around it. It's like that's the coward's way. The strong man's way is to head straight towards it. This is what I'm going to do, right? There's a Skirnismal when he's standing there and he's speaking, Skirnir's speaking to Gerd, and she threatens him with her father. My father's going to come and he'll cut your head off, or whatever she says. And he's like, he tells her, my fate was laid out before me on my day of birth. Every moment of my life is destined. I'm not afraid. And that's what that is. And so that's where the heroism comes. That's where it's like, I have a script to play out. I have a destiny to meet. And you see, we created the greatest civilizations, the greatest ideas, the greatest concepts. And all of these people, from Rome to Greece to the Slavic countries, Celtic countries, Nordic countries, all of them believed in this, right? Because they all had systems of divination. They all had beliefs in fatalism. They all had that. The Greeks had their own fates. That's where we get the word, the fates, right? And so they had fatalistic systems within them, and they faced it anyway. And they weren't afraid, and they did what they had to do. And they didn't say, well, this is going to hold me back because I'm a slave or an automaton. They said, no, I'm a hero because I see the fire in front of me and I'm running towards it. And that's what that is. That's how that works. And so it's like you ask yourself, why do heroes act? Why do they do the things they do? It's because you reach a state of acceptance. It's a humility. It's not like a saying, I'm the biggest, baddest guy in the world. It's a humility. I am not stronger than this. I am not greater than the web of destiny itself. And I am just a part of it. I'm a part of the universe. I'm part of something that's greater than myself. I'm part of existence, and I have to play my part and meet that destiny. As I'm doing so, I'm going to be heroic because I know I have to play this part. I know I have to be that ripple, right? And I'll be the biggest damn ripple in the world because I have to, And so all the great heroes saw this. And all of them are viewed as this, like Helgi Vida, Helgi. He's like shown in the beginning of his very birth that the Norns come down and they weave his web. And he's destined to be a great king. And they lay the threads in four corners because that's where his kingdom is going to lie, right? So this idea of being destined for greatness, for doing something great, is just within you. And you don't see it as something that's going to hold me back, something that's going to, maybe this will happen, or maybe I'm not destined, or maybe if I'm doing bad things, it's okay, or whatever. No, man, it's everything you're doing is already known. It doesn't matter, right? Because it's already there. So you just play the script out. You do what you have to do, and you keep pushing forward. And then when you face the gods at the hell thing, you're going to be like, I did the best that I could. I was the best man that I could be. The best woman that I could be, the best person. I raised my kids. I did, taught my family everything I could. I taught my kids how to be strong. I did everything I could. I faced dangers. I faced fears. I overcame, because that's what you're supposed to do. And then that fear goes away because it's like the destiny's there anyway, And I think so much of, like, psychologically speaking, when we're looking at the world around us, we see so much fear. And it's because everybody's thinking, I got free will and I can do whatever I want and all that. And there is no system that connects me to anything else. And so I'm isolated. I'm alone. I'm by myself. I mean nothing. And from that comes nihilism, right? And so if you start to see yourself as part of a web of destiny, a web of existence itself, and that you can make these ripples happen, but they're already destined to happen, right? Right now, you're all listening to me speak to you. You're hearing what I'm saying. And that's a ripple, right? But it was already written. It was already going to happen. It was already going to take place. And so when people think that they can control it, look what the gods go through, They go through all of these changes to try to save Balder. And it all ends up being for nothing, because he was destined to die. There was no changing it. And so they're thinking, like, we're the gods. We can change it. We'll go to everything and make the oaths. We'll go to everything and ask for the prophecies. We'll go to everywhere we possibly can, and we will make this stop because we cannot lose Balder. We love him too much. And it's like, well, he's got to die. He has to die, but he has to die for a reason. And so part of Odin's prophecy and understanding what he gets is he understands that Balder has to die because he's going to bring back the renewal at Ragnarok, right? He's got to bring back the new race of great gods and people and stuff like that to teach them peaceful ways and good things so this doesn't happen again. So that's what it is. That's how we look at this. And that's how we understand that, in these sources, we have so many different ideas on it's fixed, that this is unchangeable, that you're a part of this system and you can't escape it, right? And so when you're looking at this, and you're looking at honor, right? Law and honor and all that. And people would make that cop out. Well, I'm just destined to be a bad person. Say, no, it's known that you're going to be a bad person, right? But that doesn't control you. It's not like a puppet on a string. You still make your choices. You still decide to do these things. It's just something is a step ahead of you and knows what's going to happen when it happens, right? So you still make the choices to be a good person, because then you want to see that you're part of the system. Then you know you have to protect that system because you're part of life. You're living your life. You're living your existence. And so you have to have order. You have to have peace. You have to have laws. You have to be a good person and live a moral life, a decent life as a good person. And so that's why our ancestors were so very much about law, right? The very word for fate is the original law. And they built the legal systems. They built the legal structures because people who would do bad things had to be punished. And the punishers knew that they were following fate as well. I remember in Locasena, they're talking to Loki's like, running his mouth off like the gods and all that stuff. And they tell him, look, he's driven by fate. Fate is driving him to do this. And it's going to also drive the gods to punish him for doing it. And so that shows you that it's a system outside of the divine. It's not that the gods are doing this to you. It's that it is. And that's all I got. Thank you, guys.